Pokračujeme, dáme si taký, toto má byť workshop a chceli sme, aby sme tu sa tak všetci zoznámili, aby sme to neboli, že cudzí, tak sme rozmýšľali, aké to spravíme a vymysleli sme takú hru, koľko nás je? 20? Takže by sme sa rozdelili do skupín po 4, ak môžem, najlepšie by bolo, ak by ste sa dali dokopy s ľuďmi, ktorých nepoznáte. Ale môžeme to takto robiť, že dáme každému číslo. Dobre, ale ešte nám chýbajú ľudia, tak to je ťažko. Dobre, každopádne rozdielme sa do skupín náhodne po 3-4 ľuďoch. Ja vám dám otázku a vy budete 3-4 diskutovať a budem od vás chcieť jedno slovo, ktoré bude na tú otázku akože nejakým spôsobom odpovedať. Môže byť tých slov aj viac, pretože pravdepodobne budeme mať rovnaké slova a my ich potom spíšeme a budeme sa ďalej baviť. Čiže ak vás teraz môžem nejakým organizovaným spôsobom poprosiť sa dať do skupín 3 až 4, alebo to mám odrátať? Dobre, urobme to tak, že každému dám číslo a koľko bude skupín. Alebo my zvládneme? Tak ak sa zvládnete zorganizovať, tak sa zorganizujte, prosím. 2 je fajn, to je úplne fajn. Dobre, tak keď sme rozdelení, ďakujem pekne za tento effort, ktorý ste urobili. Otázka je, vysnite jedným slovom, aký je vzťah podľa vás mládeže k výučbe najnovších dejín, k výučbe dejín, ako je fašizmus a týmto témam. Jedným slovom, môžete mať aj viaceré slova, keďže pravdepodobne budú rovnaké. Máte na to minútku, 2 a potom ich budeme zbierať. Ďakujem.
Takže, ak dovolíte, kolegovia a kolegyne, my sme iba 2 v skupine, tak vyšlo a zhodou okolností jedna učíme na základnej škole a jedna na strednej. A už sme prišli na to, že to je obrovský rozdiel. Evidentne to je vekom našich študentov, respektíve zverencov. Takže ľahostajnosť a zvedavosť. A môžete si tipnúť, ktoré bude na základnej škole a ktoré na strednej.
Ignorance and curiosity. We are teachers. One is at the elementary school and one at the secondary school. The lahostajnosť is ignorance.
Indifference.
Or indifference, better to say. Indifference and curiosity.
Dobre, máme ďalej. Čo zaujímavé máme?
Tak my sme prišli na slova, sme učíme základné.
We teach at basic schools and the secondary school. And what we have is excitingly alienated. But I translate. Marta, my tu sedíme a tlmočíme.
No, my sme taká zmiešaná skupina.
We are a mixed group, an NGO scientific project. I'm a teacher at secondary school, gymnasium. And we've agreed that first you have this appetite. First you have this appetite in Second World War. That would be the key. And then re-evaluation.
Môže byť také aj z pohľadu toho, že je to buď, že je to vlastne len to učivo, ako aj predtým.
So, and that re-evaluation is in the way that, it's another stuff to learn, or they start to search behind the ideas behind it. So it is not only this excitement about the document, the battles, etc., but they see also the question mark, so that would be a re-evaluation.
Na
We are also a mixed group, an NGO. I am from public administration and a teacher. Marcel is a teacher, which is attended mainly by Roma children. And we have three words or three approaches. One is they feel lack of information and they feel uncertain in the field. Then the consequence is curiosity. And at the same time, some children feel oversaturated about the topic because from every angle they hear about the theme in new way by using new methods, etc. So the three concepts are uncertainty, curiosity, and oversaturation. In our group is mixed, one teacher, another teacher, and non-profit. And we have this polarity of interest and disinterest. I meet only students who voluntarily joined and want, and teachers encounter also pupils, students who have no interest in the issue. We have in our group somebody from the scientific field, a documentary center, and I am a small NGO. And we agreed, or we discussed, how the students ignore the issue, are not interested. Some are interested, but they see it as very boring time. And there would be a small addition. It's a boring event organized by the state. My colleagues participated in drafting textbooks for students, which are so often criticized, and they tried to have open questions, and the ministry instructed them that no question may be an open question, open-ended question, because every question must have a clear answer in the textbook. So we see that the authors of textbooks are often criticized, but it is not their fault. It is the state who instructs them how to write the books. We had a mixed group, a sociologist, a history teaching theoretician, and an NGO, and we agreed that one is indifference, and the indifference is a consequence of the difficulty of the issue, because it is a topic that is very difficult to be grasped by the pupils and students, and therefore they are mostly indifferent to the topic.
Very much for your input. Now, Marta, máte to v angličtinu? So, this is in English for you. Maybe you can comment on that. This is the relationship of students towards the modern history and what it characterizes. If you look at those words, what comes to your mind? What do you think? Are we doing a mistake somewhere, or?
Well, I must explain that I teach in a university. It's the second university of Oxford, called Oxford Brookes University. Oxford University does not even know we exist. But we're at the top of the hill, and if you stay on the bus, you get to the real Oxford. So I'm in an unreal university. And I am dealing with people who were, they're called millennials in English. They were, for them, the Second World War is ancient history. Most of them are white, public school educated, home counties. They are the counties around London. In other words, they don't realize it, but they are completely unrepresentative of England and certainly of Britain. They have a good conscience about being British. They do not associate Britain with war crimes or a corrupt government in the Second World War or collaboration. That all happens over there. The boys the males are perennially fascinated with cruelty, evil, torture, death, destruction, bombs, violence. It is a generalization, but I have no problem at all getting students, when they volunteer to write topics. I have a lot of people who want to write about the Holocaust and genocide because they find it sexy. I mean, there is a continuation in their imagination between video games and violent films and Batman and the Nazis. And in fact, if you look at Hollywood horror films, quite often, I remember an episode of The X-Files where there was this mysterious ship full of horror, and it was being run by SS Gestapo. So if you are young, born in 1998, and if you map the world, there's Britain, and there's football, and there's television, and normality, and going skiing at Easter, etc. And then there's a mythic zone where history and fantasy and horror and fun and games all mix. Yeah. Now, what I have to do is take those who are interested in violence and lead them to understand why and who is responsible. Now, the female students have a different relationship to fascism. This is very gendered, and I find it very interesting the way when they choose their topics. I don't just teach Nazism, I teach a course on fascism. These are gender stereotypes, but the female students tend to be much more interested in the life under Nazism, the resistance, what happened to families, the experience of concentration camps. So I'm afraid stereotypes are sometimes true, yeah? And again, I have to take this interest and explain what the Nazis thought they were doing to create their new order, their new Germany, and why this caused victims. So, but I am lucky because I'm teaching at university. Students in schools in England, they used to, in the 1950s and 1960s, they still studied Nazism and the Third Reich and the Second World War as a topic. But one of the interesting things that has happened in the last 20 years is that the course that used to be on Nazi Germany, the Third Reich, has disappeared. Now it is Germany from 1870 till 2000. So they teach what's called in English a survey course, where the Third Reich is one part of a continuous German history. Now, on one level, I think this is very good, because I grew up in an England where Germans were Nazis. German and Nazi was the same thing, right? Now, if you are a school boy or schoolgirl now studying history, you will hit Nazism as one episode in a much bigger arc or parabola or narrative. And I think that is good because it demonizes Germany. But on the other hand, there's a thing called the battle for memory. And if you know anything about Holocaust denial, there are people who are using the fact that the generation that lived the Second World War is dying, and now we have the point where historians and journalists and filmmakers have to fight two habits. One is to forget, and the other is to create new myths, which are dangerous myths. So there's a balance between forgetting the Second World War and also having a new version of the Second World War, which is instrumentalized by nationalists, fascists, anti-Semites, and other people who want to exploit the ignorance of what happened for their own political motives. So I think that school children studying history are the same all over the world. I actually think that when you put things in a textbook and you have to study for an exam, it closes down parts of the brain. It makes it very, very difficult for people to engage emotionally. You have to be an exceptional teacher. And I would like to say to you that I think you have a much more difficult job than university lecturers. We don't have problems with discipline, and we don't care if people don't turn up. It's their problem. They choose to do the subject. You have to impose a subject on adolescents who have many other distractions. So you really have to teach. University teachers don't teach. I don't really teach. I just run courses. So I think you are in a very particular situation. You are the custodians of memory. The way you present the memory of the past and make the past alive, present and real is extremely important for the generation coming through. Because if you can think how ignorant their children will be, I mean, you think that this generation is ignorant. You wait 20, 30 years, where I don't think many people will read at all, and they will have very big thumbs because they will be texting so much their brain and their hands will atrophy, and they will be left with a generation of thumbs who live in an eternal present. So to keep writing alive, literature alive, memory alive, and use museums, visits to places, survivors, to make the subject come alive, this is very important. And where I find ministers of education very dangerous is that they want curricula, they want exam results, they want to teach a national history. I believe that the true value of history produces things which cannot be assessed, which cannot be quantified, which cannot be evaluated. Passion, interest, literacy, interest, curiosity. How do you evaluate? How do you give a mark for that? You have to produce exercises which you can mark, but there has to be an invisible quality which you cannot mark. The interest in open questions, the idea that history is complicated, the idea that historians do not agree with each other, that there are real debates, that people have thousands of different perspectives on the same issue, that there is, for example, just in Slovakia, there are generational differences in the way you remember the war. There's certainly big differences if your family was communist, or if it was nationalist, or if it was fervently Catholic, or if it was Roma, or if it was Jewish, or if it was... all these are different wars, all these are different memories. So my basic point is this. What I try to do with my students is start with things that make things real in the past, which are happening now. A huge issue in Britain is Islamism, ISIS, terrorism. We have had an ordinary British citizen who was not born a Muslim, and he drove a car along Westminster Bridge and killed people. Why did he do that? And when you go into it, he converted to Islamism, not to Islam, but Islamism. He read a statement from ISIS that he should not go to Syria, he should attack in England. He hired a car, and he drove this car. Now, that is a starting point. If you take an incident of violence which happens now, and then you explain the fact that he was not mad, this was idealistic violence. In his head, he was doing something important for the world. And once you start getting students interested in the role of ideology in creating violence happening now, you can go back in time and say, well, what did the French revolutionaries think they were doing with the guillotine? What did the Bolsheviks think they were doing with the gulags? What did the Nazis think they were doing with the concentration camps? Why did they put homosexuals and Roma and Jews and intellectuals? Why did the big buildings of the Nazis get built with stone which was being carved at Mauthausen by European intelligentsia? What is this madness? Why? And once you get the curiosity about the why of violence, then you can start going into propaganda and state institutions and all these other things. If you start with the Nazi state, you will kill the subject. But if you start with the sexy bit, the violence, the hatred, the fascination of inhumanity, and then unpack that and make it explicable in terms of what people do for an ideal, what a fanatical Muslim does for an ideal, what a fanatical Nazi does for an ideal. In England, we had a man in Cardiff, in Wales. He saw a program about a sex ring in Rochdale, in the north of England. It was a reconstruction of sexual grooming which involved hundreds of young girls. And this man, sitting watching his television in England, was so horrified that he hired a lorry and drove to London and waited till the Muslims came out of the mosque and drove the lorry into these people. Which is crazy, but it has its own logic. It has its own rationale. And once you start making violence explicable in terms of history, ideology, identity, and idealism which has become perverted, idealism which has become dehumanizing, then things like fascism, Nazism, and revolutions, and what's going on in Syria, they all become part of the human situation. But of course, governments do not like this. Ministers of education are often occupied by people who were not very good at school and really have very little understanding of history or human nature or what it's like to be a teacher. They want tidy history. History is untidy. History is messy. I teach, every year I go to a school where my son went when he was 11. I teach the 13-year-olds for an hour about terrorism. And we start with the idea of evil. Are these people evil? And I won't give you the lecture now, but each year this group of, they're nicely brought up, rich, middle class, white, good. They write the most amazing, their task is they have to choose a terrorist and look at why the terrorist did what he or she did. And the work is fantastic. No child is too young, from about 11, I think, to look at the negative side of history and the negative side of human nature. I introduced the topic of evil very gently. I went to Oslo, where I went to the island of Utøya, where Breivik killed 69 people. I talked to a survivor who was at the side of the island when Breivik was walking around the island shooting people individually. Breivik looked at him, pointed the gun at him, and then there was a noise and he turned round and walked off. You know, when I tell this story, a 13-year-old can be very, very interested, yeah? And then we go into why. What did Breivik think he was doing? Why did he kill Labour Party young people and not Muslims? He didn't kill any Muslims. And yet for him, he was doing something about the problem of Muslims. And when you start explaining, and you start with a real human moment, and then start explaining what he thought he was doing, these young minds, like a sponge, they go, yeah? And they can apply this knowledge. And I think that we have to start with the human. We have to not start with the Third Reich. We have to start with a single incident and unpack the incident and make it more symptomatic of something much, much bigger. If you understand one Nazi, you won't understand all Nazis, because all Nazis are different. There's not a single Nazi. But I believe the way into difficult history is to start with the human and then lead into the really difficult things about ideology and organizations and institutions and the propaganda and brainwashing. One little bit of history which I like using is the word propaganda. It comes from the Latin de fide propaganda. It was a council of the Vatican created to propagate the Catholic faith. The Catholic Church invented the word propaganda. When Goebbels created the Ministry of Propaganda, he didn't say the Ministry of Lies. He was propagating the Nazi faith. There was a Nazi belief. There was a Nazi faith. If you teach Nazism as evil, created by monstrous Germans, it is not historical and it creates fiction. But if you start with the idea that why were Jews so frightening to Nazis, and you make a link with what's happening in England now. We have an organization called the English Defence League, EDL. We also have a wonderful little organization called Britain First. Britain First made a video, and Trump retweeted the video because he didn't realize that these people were fascists. So, for example, in one of my classes at Brooks University, I found the video that he retweeted, and I took the class from the video into contemporary fascism and racism, and then back to the interwar period. So I tried to take students on a journey from the familiar and the immediate into the difficult things. And I think it is what all teachers do in their own way. So for me, Nazism is not important in itself. It is ancient history. The past is a foreign country, we say in English. You are taking people to a different country which happens to be geographically here. But Nazism for me is important because it is a case study. It's a way of studying something eternal about human history and human nature. The capacity for organized violence in the name of an ideal. The Aztec civilization captured warriors and ripped their heart out and threw the hearts down the steps of the pyramid to keep the sun going. They believed that if there was not blood of warriors every day, the sun would die. The Nazis believed they had a magic view of the world. They believed if they could kill the racially inferior, if they could kill communism, if they could kill Jews, if they could kill homosexuals, if they could clean up, if they could make the Aryan race healthy and make them sport-like and make them like Greek statues, the world would be saved. And in the name of that ideal, they committed horrific atrocities. The Catholic Church believed that there was something worse than Nazism, which was communism. Communism is atheistic. It wants to destroy religion. It wants to destroy God. My enemy's enemy is my friend. We will support an enemy because this enemy is better than the other enemy. So all these terrible compromises, all these terrible things that happen in modern history, they happen for idealistic reasons. And once you make the connection in the student's head between ideals and violence, then when you see the violence, you ask, is the person mad or have they got an ideal? And once you get people interested in ideals, then you can start talking about our ideals, humanistic ideals, the ideal of a world without torture, without starvation, where families can live and breathe and be nice to each other and create babies and have dogs and enjoy nature. And so I present history as a battle between ideals, not a battle between people. So when I teach Nazism, I try to counter it with stories of heroism and stories of people saving Jews and people trying to stop Nazism. There's a wonderful film called Alone in Berlin, which is just, I don't know if it's come out in Slovakia. It's based on a book by a man called Falada, and it's about a couple. It's a true story. They hated Nazism. They knew what would happen to them. They left messages in Berlin on pieces of paper attacking Nazism. They had to do something, and eventually, they were discovered and they were killed. But they had to say no, and it's a most inspiring story. So you try to create a balance between the stories which are depressing and frightening and negative, and the stories which make you believe again in human nature and human love. Because I am an old hippie, and I remember the dream of the hippies in the 60s when America was fighting another horrific war in Vietnam, and a whole load of young people said, this is mad. There must be another way. And so I believe that conflict between every generation, every country, has the equivalent conflict that the American hippies had between their idealism and Jimi Hendrix and love and drugs and the state. And there is an equivalent struggle going on in Slovakia now. There's an equivalent going on in Northern Ireland, and in everywhere you go, every country has its own battle. And you have to put yourself on the side of humanity and peace and love and hope. And sometimes your enemy is your own Minister of Education. And you have to take a stand very gently and quietly. I had a row as a professor when I was head of department. We were inspected. Now, we say in English that those who can do, those who can't teach, and those who can't teach inspect. Yeah? So the state Gestapo came to inspect our history course. And the person who came from the Minister of Education believed that everything should be quantified, everything should be recorded. Every course has goals which you can write down, and then you have to assess how the course fulfills the goals. And so I had to write the course guide. I had to write the statement of what the course tried to do. And so I wrote down all the things it had to do to make people literate and learn how to use books and learn how to write essays. And then I had a whole section on unquantifiables, things that cannot be quantified, which you cannot make happen, but which you hope happens. And this minister, this inspector, he had an argument with me, saying, this is nonsense. Where does this come from? But fortunately, there were two external professors from other universities, and they sat there silently. One was a woman, one was a man. And when he brought them in and said, what do you think? And he hoped that they would attack me. They said, I will put this in my course guide. I want Roger to send me this, because every course statement should allow for things that you cannot guarantee, that you cannot make happen, but which you hope will happen. You do this, and you hope that will happen. If you reduce history to learning and testing, then you miss the point of history. The point of history is that it is part of the humanities. And humanity is something much bigger than learning and examinations and preparing people to be docile, tame, passive citizens. It has to produce people who say, this reminds me of terrible things that happened in the past. This is my battle. There was a Jew called Primo Levi. Primo Levi was trained as a chemist in Turin. He was a very fine chemist, and towards the end of the war, he was put in a camp by the fascist regime, and he was taken from the camp by the Nazis to Auschwitz. He was young, he was fit, he was a mountaineer, he climbed in the Alps, and he survived Auschwitz partly because he was a chemist, because they needed chemists to work on artificial rubber in the Buna works. When he got into Auschwitz, he could not believe what was happening, and he had a revelation. He said, I am here to remember. I will remember. I must survive, because somebody must explain and tell this story. And this produced a book called If This Is a Man, and etc., etc. After the war, he went back to becoming an industrial chemist. And at the time, Italy was trying to rebuild its industry, and one of the partners was a German chemical company, IG Farben, which had had slaves in Auschwitz. The director of this company comes to Turin, and they have a dinner party with the head of the Italian company. But they don't speak Italian. So Primo Levi sat at the meal, and he acted as an interpreter between Italian and German. And the wife of the director said, but your German is fantastic. Where did you learn it? And he said, in Auschwitz. And she did not say another word. Yeah. The Germans call it Vergangenheitsbewältigung. It is very German. Mastering the past. You cannot master the past. That is very male. You can live with the past. You can try to understand the past. You can try to learn from the past. You can try to cope with the past, but you cannot master the past. We must not teach students to conquer the past, to turn it into things you can learn and write essays about. That is part of a much deeper process, which is how to be human and how to live in a world which is imperfect, full of cruelty and suffering and corruption. And we must put our students on the side of idealism and good and humanity. So when they see inhumanity, they stand up and they say, no, this is familiar, this rings a bell, this rings a warning bell, this is not good. And it can happen in a liberal democracy, it can happen in a totalitarian state. There is a battle, and the battle will continue. So I would like to say that you are in a very important position. You have all that planning and marking and examining and all that work. It's a very, very hard job. But never forget that beyond the work and beyond getting people to university and all this, there is this fantastic privilege that you are working on the good side of history against the bad side of history. So you use bad history to increase good. Bertolt Brecht said, we must leave the world a better place than it was when we came into it. Now, I think the world is a lot worse place than when I came into it, but we can still keep trying, and we can still use the privilege of having a job which is very badly paid, which is not appreciated by the general public, which most parents do not understand, but nevertheless, we are working like undercover agents, like spies for good. We are part of a resistance movement against inhumanity, lies, fake news, Trump, Rico, and all these people, Theresa May, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, who lied to the British people about the Gulf War and about weapons of mass destruction. Everywhere you are, as they say in Italian, tutti il mondo è paese. Wherever you go, the world is the same in a different way. So I have nothing to teach you about your history or about teaching. You could teach me about teaching. I'm not a teacher, I'm just a lecturer. But I think you are in a very special moment in Slovakia where you're a young, old nation, and you are part of the task of creating civil society and healthy responses with young people. And that is more important than what grade they get and what sort of job they get afterwards. Because if you can equip people to be curious and have a sense of complexity, then you will have done your job, even if it is not recognized by other people who inspect you. Yeah? You give the inspectors what they want, but you carry on with your work. Okay?
Are there any questions from the audience? If there are, we can. If not, I will maybe switch topic a little bit, because as we have a teachers here, there's one huge question that I know you answered like hundreds of times, but I will give you this question anyway. Can you explain us what fascism is and how it is today? What we see today, is what we see today fascism, or is it not? How can we work with those kind of things?
Okay. So I'm sorry if people have heard me talk about this already. But when I came into fascist studies, no historian agreed about what fascism was, unless you were a Marxist. The Marxists have always known what fascism is. It's a pathological form of capitalism and nationalism. Yeah, okay. But I'm not a Marxist. And every book about fascism had a different definition. So I started reading fascists. I started off with Italian fascists because they call themselves fascists. I can read Italian, German, French and Spanish. So I looked at what fascists were saying, and I discovered a pattern in the ideology which academics had not seen. And the reason they had not seen was that they actually weren't interested in fascists. They were interested in what fascism did. They were interested in the violence and the war and the state structure. The parallel I draw is with Catholicism. If you studied the conquistadores in Latin America and the Spanish Inquisition and the role of Catholicism in Slovakia in the Second World War, and you were asked, so what is Catholicism? You'd say, well, it's this destructive, cynical, anti-woman, cruel institution that loves torturing people. No, if you ask a Catholic says, no, there is a God, there is a Christ. It's about the soul, it's about salvation. It's the same with fascism. If you look at what fascism does, it is absolutely horrific. If you look at what Bolshevism does, Marxism is pathological. But that's to do with the institutionalization of a utopia. Fascism had a utopia. In French, for some reason, they say, cherchez la femme. Well, I say, cherchez le mythe. Look for the myth. If you understand an episode of history, look for the myth. The English Civil War, the First World War. Why? Why? Because there was a myth in the First World War. There was a myth in fascism. So I dedicated myself to studying the myth that explained the action. And I found that all fascists agree on the myth. The most interesting thing for me was that there were many fascists who studied other fascisms. I'll give you a trivial example. Codreanu in Romania was an intellectual. He went to university in Bucharest. He spoke French. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was very interested in Mussolini. He was very interested in Nazism. He didn't want to be a Nazi. He wanted to be a Romanian fascist. He knew exactly what fascism was. He wrote about it. If you talk to neo-fascists now, who were the real fascists? Primo de Rivera, Codreanu, Georg Strasser. I mean, they know their iconography. They have their pantheon. So what was fascism? Well, what I discovered, and I could prove with my theory was that fascists, real fascists, not the opportunists, not the fellow travellers, not the people who joined because they wanted a career or they did not want to be shot. I'm talking about the ideological fascists. They saw the modern world in a state of absolute chaos and decline, decadence, collapse. They saw the world ending badly. They saw the modern world being ripped apart by three different ideologies. One was liberal capitalism, democracy, which had failed. It's an interwar period. The other was communism, which had had a revolution in Russia. Communism was going to destroy Christianity, it was going to destroy Catholicism, it was going to destroy nationalism, it was going to destroy all the national traditions, and it was going to impose a state which was going to start again. That was very scary. That was scary to nationalists, that was scary to Catholics, that was scary to anybody who was a conservative. So you either had a collapsing democracy, which had just had a First World War, economic chaos, yeah, or you had communism, or was there a third way? Was there another possibility? Yes, we take nationalism. We get rid of the anarchy of liberal democracy, of elections, of voting, and we have a new type of national state based on the nation, but not just a liberal nation. This is an organic nation. To be Slovak is something deeper than your little life and a passport and an identity card and a national security number and a tax number. You can have all those and not be Slovak. You are Slovak if you have a deep irrational dusha which has love of the nation, and you cry at the right music and you see mountains and you feel like in the sound of music, and you see a Slovak woman or a Slovak man, or you see a Slovak team beat Russia at football or at ice hockey, and you feel things, and these things cannot be felt by foreigners, by immigrants, by people who've not been touched by. My mother was like this about Britain. If you read Mosley is very interesting. Mosley was our English fascist. He was very, very English. He was an aristocrat. He was Sir Oswald Mosley. He had represented England in fencing in the Olympics. He was an Olympic sportsman. The British state never took the Sir away. He died, Sir Oswald Mosley, didn't he? The bastards. Take the Sir away. How can you be a leader of a fascist movement in England, which by the 1930s was supporting Nazism and was anti-Semitic, and still call him Sir? You read Mosley and his newspapers, they knew exactly what was going on in the rest of the world. Ezra Pound writes articles about universal fascism. Every country would have its own fascism. It was like Body Shop. It was like McDonald's. You know that the McDonald's in Paris is different from the McDonald's in Bratislava. If you watch a film by Tarantino called Pulp Fiction, the two killers talk about the differences between different McDonald's, because every McDonald's is a national dish. Fascism was a franchise, like ISIS. Every Muslim nation can have its own Islamism. Every country has its own fascism. If you're an American fascist or an Argentinian fascist or a Slovak fascist, it will be very Slovak, it will be very English. What was English fascism? For Mosley, England was declining, it was losing its greatness, it was losing its empire, it was losing its way. In the Elizabethan period, we had Queen Elizabeth I, we had a great navy, we had Shakespeare, we had poetry, we had madrigals. If you've never heard of a madrigal, it's a very strange piece of English music. We were great. There was a time when art, poetry and science and imperial power and the navy all came together. There was an English genius. We created the Industrial Revolution. We conquered an empire. We were great. But But what has happened since the First World War? We are declining. We are becoming weak. We must become great again. Remember Trump? I want to make America great. Well, he's not a fascist, but the myth is the same. We were once great, now we are weak. What are our enemies? Our enemies is communism, liberalism, sexual confusions about transgender and feminism and homosexuality. We want the family, we want men to be men and women to be women. Women must go back to the home and breed Slovaks, breed English people, they must go back to their role. But this is a heroic role. You are doing it for the race, you are doing it for the nation. We want moral values, we want clarity, we want hierarchy, we want a leader and obedience and people working hard. We don't want fun. There must be joy in work. Kraft durch Freude. Strength through joy. You know, the Volkswagen was originally called the Kraft durch Freude Wagen. And the German motorway was called the Adolf Hitler Straße. So konnte man einen Kraft durch Freude Wagen auf der Adolf Hitler Straße haben. That would make Kraftwerk sound a bit boring, okay? Fun auf der Adolf Hitler Straße, it doesn't work, okay? Fun auf der Autobahn. So, you had joy as a fascist. Fascism was about joy, about health, about the joy of being Slovak or the joy of being German, and knowing that you had a clear identity rooted in tradition, language, culture. Even in German films, even the clouds are German. If you watch Leni Riefenstahl documentaries, the mountains are German, the cows are German, the trees are German, everything is German. And then you move to England, and that's what Mosley wanted to do. He wanted Britain to become Britain again. So fascism was a utopian, revolutionary ideology trying to create a fantasy of a world made up of fascist nations which respected each other because the enemies were common. The enemies were communism and atheism and all these various things. So now fascism is entirely different. Why? Because the world now, the enemies are not communism, and liberal democracy is now the norm. So fascists are very rare. There's a very small number of real fascists. Trump is not a fascist. Populism is not fascist. Brexit is not because of fascism. Breivik was a fascist. Why? He wanted to start a revolution. A fascist is a revolutionary. A fascist hates cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, foreigners, Americanization, the corruption of the language, materialism, people becoming obsessed with IKEA furniture or whatever. Fascists are full of hatred of things which are like contamination of this mysterious essence of the nation. They are very rare now. I have a few fascists who write to me, and they're quite unusual. They like me because I understand them. They say, yeah, you understand. I am an idealist. Yeah? Most of what is called fascism now is not really fascism. These people have no revolutionary agenda, the people which are called fascists. The main danger now is not fascism, but populism. Now, populism is a very particular force. It embraces liberal democracy, but it says, I want liberal democracy only for my race. I call it ethnocratic liberalism. Ethnocratic, power to the ethnos, power to the people. If you want to understand the mentality of populism at an extreme, look at Republican South Africa. The South African apartheid state had liberalism if you were white, but if you were black, you had no liberalism. Populists in England want liberal democracy for the English, but not for immigrants, not for Pakistanis, not for Muslims, not for people they consider to be un-English. In other words, they have an ethnic concept of race in a liberal concept of constitution. Populists want to get rid of the alien elements in their liberal democracy. La France pour les Français. Les Français d'abord, les métèques dehors. France for the French. When they say France there, the Front National, they don't want a revolution. They don't want a new France. They want France, but without foreigners, ethnic others, Muslims. They have a myth of Frenchness, but they don't want a fascist revolution. This is a very powerful force. It's powerful in Switzerland, which has voted against the building of mosques. It's powerful in Denmark. It's powerful in Sweden. It's got quite strong in Norway. It's got quite powerful in Holland. All these liberal democracies, the danger is not fascism. It's people who say, I am Dutch and you are Muslim, you cannot be Dutch. In Italy now, in the last elections, the Lega Nord and the Cinque Stelle are starting to talk about Africans as not being Italian. They can't be Italian because Italian is something traditional, cultural. It's about opera and Dante and the Middle Ages and language. If you're Albanian, you can have an Italian passport, but you can't be Italian. So the danger of populism is it redefines citizenship in terms of ethnicity. I would not be worried about fascism if I were you. Be worried about populists. They're the danger to civil society because they accept civil society for the ethnos. They have a myth of what it is to be Slovak, which excludes Roma, or could exclude Jews, or could exclude third world people who come here from Nigeria or Afghanistan. And what I say to these people is, they may not be able to speak Slovak now, but you wait till the next generation. These will be your doctors, these will be your lawyers, your dentists, your school teachers. These will be working in NGOs. There is a massive demographic collapse in many countries. Italy is declining. There are going to be big problems about workforce and looking after old people. We need migration, we need integration, and we must start really integrating people into civil society and wait for the next generation to master the language and have multicultural instincts. So fascism, you will meet it. They have websites, they have rock music full of hatred, etc. But they're like museum specimens. They really belong to the past. And they often have a myth of Hitler and a myth of the interwar period. They're very rare. If you go to Romania now, there are one or two fascists, but the main danger to Romanian society is not the fascists, but the Romanian populists who exclude parts of Romanian society from civil society. So that is what I say. Okay.
Okay, we're running a little bit out of time, so please, can we get the questions? I see Fedor has one already.
We have a president who didn't accept the neo-Nazi Kotleba party after they made it to parliament 2 years ago. What do you say? Is it so that you would disagree with his stance? Not politically, but because you say that, okay, don't worry about this. These are not fascists, you know, because they are just like those museum specimens. So would you, do you think that this was a mistake, a political mistake?
What
There was an audience of all the leaders
not to talk to them.
Yeah, I think I'll give an example from British history. We had a guy called Nick Griffin. He is not a relation of me. I am Roger Griffin. Nick Griffin went to Cambridge University and he became head of the British National Party. So the BBC invited him onto a program called Question Time. Yeah. Question Time is a debate program every Thursday evening where you have members of different parties. Now, many people in Britain were scandalised that Nick Griffin was given a forum on British TV. It's watched by about 7 million people every Thursday evening. And from the moment he appeared on that programme, the BNP collapsed. He looked a total idiot. He was confronted by people who said, explain why you think there wasn't a Holocaust. And he couldn't. They were quoting him to himself, and he went red and he sweated and he looked pathetic. If you had put Hitler on that program, he would have looked totally pathetic. If you exclude people from public discourse, you have to be careful about the context. I would not invite a Nazi to Oxford Brookes and give him a platform and say, this is your show, yeah? But I would have a debate. I would have a debate with Holocaust deniers. I would have a debate with creationists who believe that science is a myth, and I would have a debate. And some Nazis can be extremely clever and but they come up against facts eventually. We had another wonderful fascist in England called David Irving, and David Irving used the format of history. His books are difficult to read, they're full of documents, they're full of footnotes, they look like a brilliant history book. And then you read them and you realize that everything is being twisted to say Nazism wasn't that different, there not that many people died, Hitler knew nothing about the Holocaust, look what England did in Dresden, everything gets sort of... So, there was a woman called Deborah Lipstadt, and she said that David Irving was a Holocaust denier. So he took her to court for libel. And so we go to the Old Bailey in London, and we have David Irving against Lipstadt. What Lipstadt did was employ the professor of history at Cambridge called Richard Evans. And Richard Evans had a team of researchers who worked on Irving's books. And they systematically exposed the lies, the myths, the mistranslations, the historical inaccuracies. And the judgment of the court, the judgment of the British judge, was that David Irving is not a historian. He has lied and cheated and he has invented things, and he is a Holocaust denier. Now, I believe that when you have Nazis in a civil society, you have to use the law against their violence because they break the law. Incitement to violence, hate speech, you use the law against them. When they pretend to be part of civil society by having electoral parties and debates, etc., you say, yes, let's debate this, let's talk about this. You choose your context properly, you choose your program properly, etc. But if you excommunicate them, if you try not to confront them, you actually help them, because you allow them to claim that they are victims of society. So I believe, yes, I believe in talking to the Taliban, I believe in talking to Islamists, and I believe in using civil society to attack the enemies of civil society. But that's my position. These are not easy issues, these are complicated issues, but that is my instinct.
Any other questions? Yeah. Marina?
I'd like to ask whether you have sometimes lectured the girls' class. The question stems from the fact that usually in the girls' group, the roles are distributed in other way. That means the most interested in violence is also a girl, the best mathematician in the class is also a girl, so it doesn't seem weird that somebody is interested in violence. And the second, if somebody chooses a topic more, let's say, violent or more about the army, do they get the matter of fact reaction, or is it, oh, like you? I wouldn't expect that.
Well, the way I teach is quite complex. I present stuff on, say, the Third Reich, and then there is a list of topics which they select. There's a thing called Moodle, it's an electronic blackboard. I try to have a spread of choices, so I have a quota for each topic. So one of the topics is women under Nazism, gender, etc. There's fantastic materials on women under Nazism, but you can get boys choosing that, you can get men choosing that, and some women choose things about there's an interest in the Holocaust, but it's a different interest. I try to encourage people to not work in gender stereotypes. I think it's very sad that most of the books about women under fascism are by women, and most of the books about Nazi violence are by men. I actually think we're still gendering subconsciously. It's like the idea that you can't be a chemist if you're a woman. I mean, this is nonsense. Why should women not be interested in violence, and why should women not be capable of violence? One of the interesting things about terrorism, if you look at the Tamil Tigers and the Chechens, there's a number of suicide bombers who are women, for example. It is a male fallacy that women are somehow naturally not violent and that men are naturally violent. These are stereotypes. So I try to teach violent parts of history like terrorism and Nazism in a non-gender specific way, and I lead it, and I try to encourage people to find their own topic, and I think, I haven't done an analysis, but I think what is very exciting now about living in Britain is that there's a new generation of feminists coming. It's a new feminism. It's about sexual harassment, and it's about pay gaps, and it's about equalizing things like that. And this is coming through with students. There are female students now who really, in the way they write essays and the way they select topics, you would not know from the topics they choose for their dissertation or whatever, you wouldn't know if they're women or not. And this is really what I think is progress, that we actually get to a point where you can't, that history stops being gendered, yeah? But I think there's nothing special about the genders when it comes to these phenomena. One of the disturbing things about Nazi Germany was just how many, for example, if the women concentration camp guards, you know, there are some absolute monsters of cruelty and inhumanity. And there are also extraordinary cases of male courage to stand up against violence. So I think we just have to break these stereotypes, even in the way we give students options about what they can study. When I put the topics up, I have no control about who does what. And then I find, when the essays come in, they're marked anonymously. And when it's only when I reveal the names of people that I know who they are, and you start seeing interesting patterns. I don't think I've quite answered your question, but I do think that I think that actually the more you mature in the study of history, the less it matters what your gender is. And similarly with, it doesn't really matter whether you're teaching as a man or a woman, as long as you bring humanity to it, it works as a subject. Please.
Ja som Hanna a ja by som sa chcela.
My name is Hannah, and I want to ask a simple question. I am a secondary school teacher, and I would like to know from you, how should I explain, based on your inspiration, the concept of populism? How can I show a person of less than 20 years how to recognize populism in a democracy?
Right. Well, there are two questions there. I mean, one is bringing it into the classroom, yeah, and it depends on the classroom. In Britain, one of the most extraordinary things about contemporary Britain at school level, outside the private schools, you can still pay for your child to go to an all-white school. But if you're in the state sector, your school will have children of migrants, children of multicultural parentage, children who do not speak English at home. They are a teaching resource. They have stories. They have stories about the homeland of their parents. Sometimes the parents are of different homelands. And if you get children, even very young children, to tell their story in front of the classroom, you will find that most children are naturally interested in otherness, in difference, they find it fascinating. If they just see them as Pakistani, then it becomes a racial category. But if they start talking about the clothes they wear, the food they eat, where they came from, what their parents did at home, then you start opening up a debate about otherness, about culture, and about multiculturalism. Now, populism is, at its simplest, in Britain, is a response to a threat that white English people feel at the fact that their country is changing, and it is changing. Very near to where I live in Oxford, there is a very large mosque, yeah? And every Friday afternoon, there are prayer meetings in my street because the community centre is taken over by male Muslims for their prayers, and the traffic blocks the street. Now, I know that if I was a populist, I would be asking, what is happening to my country? This is not my country anymore. These people have taken over. They have their own shops. I hear languages being spoken in my street. Where is my England? Where is my Britain? Yeah? Now that response is the beginning of a populist politics. And populist, more than the politics, a populist response to otherness, yes? So populism, in the way it's used now, it's not fascism, it's not straightforward racism. It starts from a sense of being a stranger in your own country, of not feeling at home in your own home anymore. And it immediately brings in myths about the other people and about your own country. There's a lot of nostalgia with Brexit. We have this terrible thing called Brexit. And there's a lot of nostalgia for a myth of England when we were sovereign and white and powerful and we had empire and we won football matches and we had English food and everything was English. And this is, of course, it's a myth, because if you go back to that time, we had horrific housing, we had very short life expectancy, we had terrible housing and living conditions and lots of disease, and if you got ill you had to pay for a doctor, but we have selective memories. If you teach the reality of the time that people look back to, they were terrible times. So populism is born of a mythic narrative, it's called. It's a story, it's a utopian story about the past, and that you're losing your identity now. So, and the way to introduce it to young people, if you're in an English school, is to look at the children themselves, because there are some schools in London where 95% of the children sitting there do not have English as a first language. 95%. There are schools in which white faces are almost non-existent. And they are schools where you really need teachers to understand culture and race and ethnicity. Now, if you go to a public school in England, there's no problem. My son went to a public school in Oxford. We have the odd Chinese rich person. We have a Russian oligarch son, you know. But about 97% of the boys there are white middle-class boys. And there you have a different problem. How do you get these kids to understand that they are living in a white, rich ghetto? They are actually not representative of our ruling elite in England, Cameron, Boris Johnson and these people. They are all from Oxbridge private schools, and they don't understand the country either. So the starting point to deal with populism is to say, let's look at the real Slovakia, let's look at the real Britain, let's look at the depressed areas, let's look at the poor, let's look at towns with problems of unemployment and Roma or whatever, and say, this is part of your country as well. And what do we feel about these people? Are they really different? Why is there alcoholism? Why is there prostitution? Why is there drugs? Are this because the people are degenerate? Is it the fault of the people? Or is this because of social and political conditions? There was a play by Bertolt Brecht where a woman it takes a racist to a poor part of town and says, what do you see here? And it's full of prostitution and drunkenness and violence. And he says, what I'm seeing is the depravity of the poor. Depravity means immorality. And she says to him, you are not seeing the depravity of the poor, you are seeing the poverty of the poor. I think that's fantastic. If you were poor, if you were desperate, if you were living in these houses, if you were living in these conditions, you would be behaving like this. So the beginning of populism is when you start judging people by their behavior and their color of their skin and their otherness, and saying, these people live like this because they themselves are not proper human beings. That's the danger of populism. It explains bad behavior or social problems not through political and social conditions, but through the character of the people. And that's why I think that it's very, very important that people understand that the real danger to civil society is not fascism or Nazism, though they are dangerous as well. It is populism and the myths of populism.
I would like to continue on what you just said. I'm Lydia. I'm a sociologist. We did some research on young radicals in Slovakia. And we know these children are here. Children, teenagers. They are maybe the teenagers of these teachers here. And what is that breaking point when they start to judge other people with these concerns that they have different color, they don't work, they are lazy, and so on? When does this start, and why some children, some youngsters are fascinated by these neo-Nazist ideas and some not? Yeah. What is the beginning of it? Who are they, and why? And why do we have this race of them in nowadays Slovakia?
Ultimately, for me, human nature and human personality is a mystery. You can have literally, I mean, there was a famous case in England of a mother with twin sons, and one son had what we call a normal life, the other became an Islamist, went to Syria, he converted to Islam, went to Syria, married a jihadi bride, and was blown up by an American drone, and that was the end of her son. They live in a place called High Wycombe. Now, if you know anything about England, when you drive from London to Oxford, there's this place called High Wycombe. It's a particular boring, normal place. Now, why did one son become an Islamist and die believing in... He wasn't even Muslim. And why? And the brother and the mother, they could not understand this, and I can't understand it. I think there is. Now, what's interesting for me, though, is that the father had died. The mother was a single parent, very middle class, very full of love, not an alcoholic, not a problem, you know. She gave lots of love to the two boys. Now, it seems to me that at some point in this complicated thing we called a personality or a psyche, one boy was saved from despair, saved from identity crisis by clinging on to the memory of the father and to the mother's love. But the other boy, for complicated psychological reasons, it wasn't enough. He entered a deep crisis of who am I, what do I do with my life? Islamism is like, you know, IKEA, you buy a cardboard box and it has a bed in it. It's an instant piece of furniture. Islamism is an instant ideology. You unpack it, it tells you who you are, why you're alive, and what to do. Islamism gave this boy, he went to a barber shop in High Wycombe, and the man cutting his hair was an Islamist. And he started talking to this boy while he was cutting his hair about Islam and about the Gulf War, which I was against, and Bush and Blair, and how they were bombing innocent Muslims and blah, 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 blah. And this boy started going regularly to the barbers, and he became indoctrinated. And at a certain point, deep in his personality, something flipped, we say in English. He went from not knowing who he was to knowing who he was. I am really a Muslim, and I have a duty to become a Muslim and do my piece for Allah, and I will go to say. And she lost her son. And they did a documentary for the BBC, and she did not understand. That's why she made the documentary. I cannot tell you why somebody becomes a Nazi or an Islamist, but what I will tell you is what I think Nazism and Islamism offer somebody who is confused, has identity problems, cannot find a place in the world. It gives you a total explanation of why you are who you are, why you feel what you feel. This is what Hitler did in 1929. He gave 34% of the German population, only a third, an explanation of why the First World War, why Weimar, why they feel bad, what will happen now, where we will go now. And he gave people hope. Paradoxically, if you convert to Islamism or if you convert to Nazism, you have an identity. We had a terrorist called David Copeland. He was a sad guy, bullied at school, quite normal, quite ordinary, bit lost, had some silly jobs. He was like millions of people. But he started resenting foreigners, and he joined the BNP. But the BNP, the British National Party, was talking. Something in him wanted action. Something in him wanted what we call in English agency. That's the ability to act. And he converted online to a very dangerous form of Nazism, the same Nazism that inspired Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma bombing. There's a book called The Turner Diary. If you read The Turner Diary, is it in Slovak? So to be a Nazi in Slovakia, you have to be very intelligent and read good English, yes? Right. The Turner Diary gives a complete picture of the modern world. The modern world is in crisis because white, Aryan, real men and women are being threatened by this horde, this crowd, this mass of degeneracy, Jews and Asians and liberals and homosexuals. And what the book shows is a war between Aryans and the rest. And this sad guy called David Copeland, who had a little flat in the suburb of London, in the secrecy of his room, he lived with a white rat called Wizzle or something, and he started creating a shrine to Nazism. He had Nazi flags, he had Nazi books, he had Mein Kampf. He started going online, he started reading Nazi websites, and gradually he went from being a loser, we say in English, somebody with no personality, you wouldn't notice him. And he laid 3 bombs in London, nail bombs. There's a famous picture of a child with an X-ray, had a nail that long in its head. And he thought he was going to provoke a race war and change history. In Mein Kampf, Hitler writes a paragraph about how brilliant the Marxists are in their public demonstrations. They have the songs, they have the uniforms, they have the flags. He says, the brilliance of a communist rally is it makes the man who is a little worm feel he is part of a great dragon. Most ordinary people who haven't got fulfilling lives, partners, jobs, hope. They feel like little worms. They feel nothing. If you join a Nazi party, or if you are Muslim and you feel marginalized and you become an Islamist, the little worm becomes part of a great dragon. That is the power of ideologies of hatred. You are no longer alone. You have agency. You can frighten people. You can feel you're part of something much bigger than yourself. Why some people need that and other people don't, I cannot explain. But I can tell you that to join a movement that makes you feel part of a great dragon is like, it's better than sex and far more long-lasting. Because you have a myth of immortality. What Nazis were told by Hitler was, you may well die early. Look at ISIS. Come and die for us. You will enter immortality. Not many men feel that when they make love, okay? I mean, well, it doesn't last very long. But to join a Nazi party, you're part of a movement, eine Bewegung. It wasn't a Partei, it was a Bewegung. You feel that you are dedicating your life to something bigger than yourself. Now, if you're a real Catholic, you don't need Nazism, a real Catholic. Not like the corrupt Catholics of the Second World War who thought they could be Catholic Nazis. I'm talking about real Catholics. If you really understand the love of Christ, you don't need to join a Nazi party because you have an immortality through your love of Christ. But for a modern world full of confusion and loss of faith and being offered materialism and pornography and iPhones, etc., some people can live with that. But lots of people long for something more important, more significant. And therefore, what I would say to you is, I cannot predict who will become a Nazi. But once they become a Nazi, I can tell you why they became a Nazi. And they did so because they joined something that made them transcend themselves, which made them feel bigger than themselves. And that is something which, once it locks in, is a very powerful seduction. I hope that helps.
Okay, unfortunately we don't have time for any more questions, so Roger, thank you very much. I believe you will be somewhere around, so if there are other questions, you just sure. Catch him. And
well, thank you for being very patient. You are a very good classroom. And for your homework, I would like you to write in 500 words a summary of what I have said today. And I will mark it and I will send it to the Minister of Education. And I will give you a grade from alpha, beta, gamma down to theta, okay? And then I will send you a certificate to show that you have been educated. Thank you very much.